Hey there, HomeLabers, self-hosters, IT pros, and engineers. Rich here. With 2025 upon us now, I thought it'd be a great idea to lay down some predictions for the coming year. And what better way to do this than to have a conversation with the great Tom Lawrence. Let's get to it. Welcome, Tom. Happy New Year, my friend. How have you been?
Fantastic. 2025's I'm excited for it. I'm optimistic.
That's good. That's good. I am too. It's hard not to be when we've seen so much change in 2024, and I guess the optimist in me is a little excited about what's coming for the future. So
Are we gonna jump right into virtualization first?
yeah, we're gonna jump.
Of course.
I kind of feel like that's
a great
a
topic.
broken record. Okay, so then I'll just ask you here. Where do you think virtualization will be going in 2025?
This is where I really like, you did a recent video on the Proxmox data center. I talk a lot about XCP&G. You reviewed that as several others. I think there's so much fallout from the scale and scope of how big VMware was that it's going to not land on a winner. Everyone tries to pick the winner as if this is a sport where there can only be one winner for the Super Bowl. We can't share a trophy. That isn't how at all that
virtualization.
Yeah. Market shares are very, very different. I think there's a great use case for Proxmox, XCP&G, and then for some of the businesses, you reviewed some of the commercial ones. I think there's going to be this breakup where we actually have a competitive ecosystem where there's actually options and companies start innovating again. I don't think it's good for a market to have a single point of failure. We look at all the problems we face with things like Microsoft owning too much of the desktop market and all the challenges. As if you work in IT, your headache is Patch Tuesday, man. Brace for impact. It's going to go rough, right. And you wouldn't have that if you worked as an IT for a company that did use Microsoft, but then there was a bunch of other companies that didn't. Patch Tuesday wouldn't be a global problem. CrowdStrike proved that we can have some global problems when you have a large company using it, focus in one space. So I think this dividing up where there's a lot of winners and there's plenty of pie to go around and distributed amongst companies, I think it's going to create a better ecosystem. And what do you think Proxmox is going? So you seem to have some enthusiasm with that video.
Yeah, well, so a little bit of backstory on the PDM thing. So I didn't know this was coming at all, right? My interaction with Proxmox has been like it's proven itself out to me in terms of being a viable virtualization platform, but I still have personal issues, emotional issues with the user experience of Proxmox. And I made a video, and instead of just complaining about it, I'll get out paint.net and I'm going to tear it apart and rebuild it. And to see PDM show up, and the first thing I saw when I booted it up and set it up was they're trying to make a centralized.
Yeah.
And it was just like, this is what they need. It also looks new. It looks fresh. It doesn't look like it's living with that baggage of the past. So I'm really excited about what they're gonna do with that, especially where it comes into the concept of this whole platform doesn't really seem to care if is it a cluster? Is it an individual host? You just put it all in there, and then in theory, we'll see this actually in practice, having it migrate between disparate nodes that have nothing to do with each other, no clusters, nothing. So I'm excited about that. I think that's a big win for them.
Oh yeah. And I joked because everyone says, well, Tom, can XO do this? And actually, to me, them doing it's a boost because I'm like, this is what Zen Orchestra has been able to do for years, is I've always been able to not just migrate between disparate clusters or pools, as they call them. I can do a live migration between completely different pools. And I don't know if Proxmox will get that feature, but these are features that are really important to large scale management. When you put this in a data center, when you want to have, if you're a larger hosting company, and many hosting companies don't just have a data center, they go, we have to have replication. We can't just be in Chicago. We got to have another location in Grand Rapids, Detroit, et cetera. So they have some geo redundancy to some extent for where their customers are. And XO is that one pane of glass. And I've always had I'm trying to figure out better ways to express it on my channel, because people are like, well, Tom likes to play with it, but my HomeLab, I like this better, but there's no way that's actually used commercially. I'm like, we're working with some, I can't say the names of the companies, but we'll just say automotive space where I'm at in Detroit. Take your pick of which ones. And yes, they do run it, and they happen to fall. I think they're still in the Fortune 500 companies. I mean, They're somewhere in there.
Yeah,
So,
for sure.
because people try to tell me it's not really enterprise. I'm like, I don't know. When a company has a net worth over $1 billion, are they enterprise? I don't
Yes.
know.
I mean,
There's
for
always
all
someone
intents
in
and
the comments
purposes.
that says not, but
Yeah.
we've seen these. It's proven itself in the market. People didn't realize how much it was in the market because Citrix always owned it. When Citrix owned it,
Mm.
Citrix. I mean,
Yeah.
this for better or worse, there's a lot of Citrix in the market, especially in the VDI space and some of
In the
the
NetScaler space, yeah, for sure.
yeah, that Citrix does that. There's a plenty of awful about Citrix, but that's why this got forked and pulled away from the awful, gross parts of Citrix and go, hey, this is one gem you guys had diamond in the rough. And the team at Vates has really brought it up to modern standards. Matter of fact, the limitation is really close to being lifted for the 2 terabyte limit for that. They're almost done with a full, they're not spaghetti code anymore, full rewrite of the API that does underlying. They greenfielded it ground up, still compatible, but they decided, this is 15 years of spaghetti code.
It's
Let's
time to
rewrite
fix
this.
it.
So that's one nice thing that the fall of VMware has done is given resources. Vates now has a big team of people, big team of high-end programmers. Rumor has it they stole a couple from Amazon because most of Amazon, 70% of Amazon runs on Zen. So they got a
Mm.
couple of those really high-end architects. And they said, what would you do if you started today and could write it and someone gave you the time and the budget to do it? And that's what they're doing.
Yeah, that's great. I love hearing that because that was one of the things that I hoped it would happen for Vates and XCP&G and Proxmox and basically all of them is when VMware fallout happened, it opened up this opportunity for people to fill in the space and get their time in the sun. I can't believe I've said that probably a billion times at this point. And you don't really know, right? You don't really know if they're leveraging that because from a whether you're a customer or you're from an outside perspective, you just see the incremental growth of change takes time, especially when
Yep.
when you're working on infrastructure, especially something like virtualization. You can't just throw things out. Like it takes effort, it takes engineering, testing, and all that kind of stuff. But it's really fantastic to hear that because that's what I want. I want a world just like you where there's a even playing field of a bunch of different options and choosing those options that are best for you in as a customer or if you're consulting for somebody that's the best fit for that business is that's the future I want. Sign me up.
Absolutely. And it's one of those things that once you have these large companies, it's so rare they ever want to refactor code. It just doesn't
Right.
happen. Once they're profitable, they're big, they don't want to rock the boat. They're like, well, we'll just keep gluing it. We'll kludge together a solution for whatever problem they're having. And we'll keep basing this on that old Apache Tomcat extra infrastructure that we started
Oh
with. Like,
gosh.
no one starts with that today. And that's why I love
Right.
when you see a Greenfield project going, all right, what if we could redo it? And, like Zen's adopting Rust. They're going, great, we're going to use a modern memory safe language to avoid all the pitfalls. So they're starting a whole rewrite of all this stuff. They started with the tools. They've really done a lot of engineering on it. But as you said, though, it's one of those things that VMware was never going to do it. VMware's never going to modify that system. The only thing Broadcom's doing is milking it.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Until that stone is bled dry. That's the see how far that gets them. Hopefully
Yeah.
not very far. But
Far enough for profits because they're looking at short term. The CEO get a pat on the back. He'll write a book going, "How I squeezed the blood out of the stone," and then
yeah.
and then left and jumped out of the plane with my golden parachute.
Yes, yeah. Or acquired another company and did it, just keeps the cycle going.
Keeps the cycle
That's
going.
what else.
It's like a
Yeah.
path of destruction.
Indeed. Yeah, I think that I you know I I can't wait. I guess what I want to say is I can't wait to see where this kind of heads because there's a lot of closed commercial companies too that I think are going to surprise us. I was going to make mention that over 2024, after the VMware thing, I would be at security conferences and other talks, and I would talk to vendors and all of these hardware vendors I'd interact with. They'd be like, "Yeah, we just don't know who we're going to back because it's just too early." But we all believe that there's going to be a huge groundswell, and there'll be something that comes in and really helps push what was left of VMware out of there. So I'm wondering if 2025 is where we see, the I hope it's a democratization, honestly, of
Yeah.
everything. So, but yeah, but speaking of that, that's obviously when you and I are talking about this, we're kind of leaning on the on-premise virtualization. Do you have any prognostications for the cloud in 2025?
Oh man, I think the bill has come. and the salespeople cannot spin it anymore. Someone has a calculator in the finance departments going, "We spent how much on the cloud? It was
Hmm.
$4 million this week." And so the it's kind of crazy. So there is a process, and I've watched this with several startups. You watch a startup and they don't know how many customers they're going to get. They got to hustle. They don't have the upfront cash to buy infrastructure to build it out. So it's easier to use a cloud. Absolutely. If you're a startup and you are hustling and hoping your SaaS app does well, then definitely use the cloud. But once you're the size of, let's say, Geico, who
Hmm.
has recently been in the news a couple times for how big their cloud bill was and how they're saving money on it, it's one of those things. I mean, I'm sure Geico has not reached the entirety of the market. I imagine they're still in growth mode like any company is, but I think they're probably have a more predictable compute. And if you have a
Right.
predictable compute load and a predictable storage load, then you start building your own data center or just racking it in a colo. And there's been a lot of companies. So the people over at Basecamp started this trend a while ago. And I love the way they've done a series of follow ups on this. And Basecamp is a pretty popular SaaS service. They have several other related services, but they started out with this follow up after like 2 years. I think they've done another 4-year follow up. We thought we could save $5 million by moving from the cloud, $5 million annually. We were wrong. We saved seven because the cloud bill went up. So they've
Yeah.
actually kept a blog with numbers in it with each year that they've done this because hardware is becoming cheaper. It makes a lot of sense to do it this way. And if you're even worried about something like, well, I want to rack it in a data center, but I can't send my staff there because it's 2-hour drive and it becomes a kind of a burden. Fully managed data centers are a thing where you use commodity hardware from Supermicro, HP, Dell, Lenovo, and you say, hey, fully managed data center people, could you stock these drives and these power supplies? Two common failure points that you'll find in a server. And they do, and they'll charge you a fee to keep that on hand and charge you
Hmm.
what someone will say is too much to replace a hard drive. But I don't know, what does it cost to send you a guy 2 hours? So
Yeah.
um, there's very reasonable ways with predictable workloads with all these different tools that are out there that you can really move from the cloud and save big. Now, the salesperson for the cloud always tells you you can't do this yourself. But as the people at Basecamp very much outlined, they thought they couldn't until they did. And they said, wow, this is a lot easier. And anyone in a home lab goes, yeah, it's pretty easy.
Yeah.
It turns out not too hard to load a hypervisor and build it. And there's numerous home lab people running full on Kubernetes across clusters of systems. And if you can learn it in your home lab, you could probably apply that to a data center in almost exactly the same way.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I think that with the minor distinction that there are some things for a business that make sense to be in the cloud. Like
Yeah.
I will die on this hill that no one should be running a mail server on premise anymore, right? It's just
Yeah.
there's some things that don't make sense to do. But I think that the promise of a lift and shift where you're taking your traditional on-premise workloads and just putting them in someone else's servers in the cloud and hoping that, well, you can. I remember when this kind of kicked in, geez, what is it, a decade ago, when there's just like, well, you can minimize your staff and that will save you some money and you don't have to buy hardware and it's just you can change it from a capex to an opex and then all of a sudden the world becomes, there's rainbows and unicorns and nobody fired any employees at the companies that
No.
I've worked with, right? They kept their staff because they just moved that from being a in-person on-premise thing to a now you're clicking buttons in a web browser and getting similar results. But you know especially when you look at the 2024 was an eye opener when it comes to Microsoft too, right? Like when we talk about like these major cloud providers and them not being the stewards that we all believe they
Oh,
were,
yeah.
right? Yeah. Patrick Gray has got this really one of my favorite lines from him is that he says, Microsoft is building the ship while they're sailing it, right?
Yeah.
And so they're out there iterating and building and doing everything they're doing in Azure. Meanwhile, there's nobody who's like cleaning up after the mess, and then you get these major egregious you know uh, situations where government systems are being accessed and oops, well, we just left a tenant open. It was a test tenant, but it like there's just they're not doing a good job, right?
Right.
So you could do that,
Yeah.
just you could do that bad of a job or even better, more likely on premise. So why not do that?
Well, and Patrick Gay has many times, I love the phrasing he uses, and Risky Business Podcast, for those that want to follow along, I highly recommend it. It's one of my
Yeah, he's
favorite
awesome.
security podcasts. Uh, he always talks about Microsoft will no problem selling you a foot gun, but not a bulletproof shoe. That comes extra.
Yeah.
Just
It's another, yeah, him, the Australian quips are the best.
yes, yes. He's the right amount of snark you should have at a podcast. And
Yeah,
he's right though. Microsoft shouldn't be selling security products. They should be selling secure products.
right.
Unfortunately, one time after another, whether it was the CISA report we read for the government breaches that happened, the report got dropped earlier in 2024, or
Hmm.
later when they misplaced almost 2 months of cloud. And that part blew my mind. They
Yeah.
misplaced 2 months of cloud logs. They're like,
Yep.
yeah, we kind of misplaced them. My favorite
Oops.
part is if you read their own timeline, they identified that they weren't receiving any telemetry for some percentage of clients. And they basically said, we started investigating. It took them 4 days before they identified the problem. And then it took them another week before. So they end up losing like 2 weeks of logs.
Yeah.
I'm like, you're a $1 trillion company. You're dealing with the security logs of people. What do you mean it took you several days to identify why the logging server stopped and then several, like 7 more days after that to fix it? Like, I get it. You're dealing with problems that are incredible. Like the size of their data centers is I like to. I was years ago. I interviewed one of the Microsoft people, and he said we don't have a data center that you could set a 747 in. You could land it in it. We're talking about the one of
I
their bigger
believe it.
ones they had built,
Yeah.
or were in the process of building at the time. I mean, I get it. They have. Like you said, they're not just building a ship, they're building an absolute ocean liner while they're sailing it. But at some point, they also know they kind of have people who are too baked into their ecosystem, really held in there tight where it's hard for them to leave. It's hard for them to migrate.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that the end result of that, hopefully, when like, you mentioned a few companies like Geico, I know there's been some others, but what this will mean is that maybe the on-premise data center is back, baby. We'll
Yeah,
see.
I think
But
so. I
I
think,
I mean, and it really, I mean, in all fairness, like most places that did lift and shift, none of them that I saw were 100%. There's just some things you can't or shouldn't do,
right.
So there's always a contingent of hardware, but I think that especially with another question I'm going to ask you here in a second, I think that it makes more sense to maybe have more of that on premise. And as a segue, I
Yeah.
will ask you. So let's change gears a little bit here, but in the context of business and infrastructure and technology here, where do you think AI will take us in 2025?
There's I put in my little notes here and I wanted to read it as it is in my notes. Here's the thing. AI doesn't know anything. It doesn't reason. It doesn't understand. It doesn't comprehend. It's a glorified pattern matcher. When you ask it for search for facts, it generates the most statistically likely set of words based on the training data. And I first just don't like the personification of AI. So once you understand that there's some training data and it produces patterns. So it has some limitations based on that because of the data. And I think of it, and people always trying to ascribe agency to it or say it's
Mhm.
conscious. But one of the things I point out to people, when you look at the absolute incredible amounts of training data that we have, and we still don't really have a good self-driving car system despite it having
Right?
thousands and thousands of hours. I look at myself. I mean, when I was 16, I got my license and I did not have that amount of training data, but I became a pretty good driver relatively quick with less hours. So if you want to know how much different the human brain is versus, where its computational ability to learn, the neural net that runs our head versus the delta between that and the AI system, it's pretty far. And
Mm, right.
it was, if you follow, what's his name? The guy that cracked the PlayStation, George Hotz.
Yeah.
He's
Yeah.
got a really good. He runs a company called Comma AI, and he really talks about just how far behind AI is. How it's not near. He's one of those people that he runs a company called Comma AI, but he's not seeking funding, and he's telling you it doesn't work the way all these people who have billions of dollars and need another $1 trillion to make it work properly. He goes, that isn't the problem, guys. And Geo Hotz is a relatively infamous hacker, so
Mhm.
I've followed along with some of his sayings on it. So I'm optimistic about where AI can go, like things we can do with it that's useful. I think it gets overhyped, which then kind of glosses over the fun things. AI is fun to help me rewrite things. Give me 5 YouTube titles for a video about this. That is,
Right.
I have not done a video in a year that I didn't start with that sentence in AI to help me find the proper title. And that is where, because we trained it on a bunch of the internet, if you will, the massive corpus of knowledge that humankind has stuck on there, it actually does get really good at predicting what the average person who watches my videos must want next. So you narrow it to
Yeah.
that context. I think those are things where AI is extremely useful. I think those are really just good ways small businesses, medium businesses, large business can use them. You can go, how does this reword this email, make it a little better, or
Mhm.
re-explain this a little better. I've actually started using it for forum posts when I'm like, I know the answer to this question. So first, I have a good knowledge of what the answer should be in my forum, but I'll grab someone's question, throw it in AI, and I'm like, make a longer explanation of this. So like, boom, 2 paragraphs of clean explain. I look at it, I validate it because I'm smart enough to do it. And then it becomes a really useful taste. I would never automate it. I would never say, grab people's questions and respond as if you're me, because sometimes AI just tells me the wrong thing. And
Right.
I was asking it XCP&G questions the other day. I don't know where it got the information from, but it was completely wrong about how a few things worked in there. And I'm like, it also likes to make up ZFS commands. Drives me crazy. If you ask it to do something, it's like there's a lot of command line tools for ZFS and there's a lot of switches. And I was like, I wonder if I could do this. I don't remember exactly what it was. It made up a whole command line for it and all the switches. Those switches don't exist. So
All hallucinated. Interesting.
yeah, it got a lot right in the beginning, but as I went down this rabbit hole of trying to programmatically set something on data sets, I'm like, I wonder if it could be automated with like a script, or could it do it this way? AI thinks it can, but it doesn't work that way.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that you hit a nail on the head there. I think that I don't subscribe to the idea that we're heading towards some sort of general intelligence either, even
No.
though maybe a BuzzFeed article of Sam Altman may say so. I think that the where I see it is exactly where you saw it too. It's become this shortcut tool for many of the things that you mentioned. I use them for the same thing. Like if I, for example, for me, it'll be like, oh, this person has said something angry at me as a YouTube comment. Let me write out what I want to say in full, whatever I want to say. And then I'm like, can you please rewrite this so I don't sound so angry? Right. And
Yeah.
then you get this like really nice, positive, sugar coated thing, which must burn the person who reads it because I'm only feeding back,
Oh
positive
yeah.
energy. But, so shortcuts like that, I think that one of the things that I think is going to happen in 2025, though, when it comes to this is I look at the businesses that I'm working with in the business I work at now. These companies are really trying to see where they could shoehorn AI into everything.
Yeah.
Like, can we use it for internal materials? Can we use it for talking to customers? Can we do chatbots? Can we do all these things? And they're seeing, like, all these companies are seeing somewhat of a little bit of success in that, enough to keep them going. But it kind of strikes me that everybody's living in maybe that little startup era we just talked about a bit ago, where we're like, oh, this stuff is really cheap, but scale it up to 1,000 licenses at $20 a pop for ChatGPT. And now you're at $20,000. And for a lot of companies, $20 a head is more than they're paying for a Microsoft E5 license, right?
Right.
For this employee. So at that point, you've gone, okay, well, now what used to be just this cost of the entire Office suite and Exchange licensing is now just this. So I'm wondering if we'll see more of it come into companies, come on, on premise. And I've spoken to some vendors too, where they have seen one that starts with a D has been, telling me that a lot of their sales haven't been about like putting in new infrastructure for like the typical whether it's virtualization stacks or whatever. Like it's not just that's just kind of the regular churn, but they're seeing a lot of companies that they would have never expected to buying boxes with GPUs so they can run their
Yep.
own local models, and then
Yep.
they can just feed it all their on-premise data, right? Every single file and mail database and all these things, they can just dump it in there, and then it becomes the same thing that they're paying $20 a head for now. Now they can own the data. They know it's not going to get used to train someone else's model. And so I think we'll see more of that, which was my segue in from the infrastructure coming back on premise. Well, now there's an additional thing, which is, if you can spend 50K or 70K on some hardware and amortize it over 3 years, 5 years, whatever it is, then all of a sudden it's cheaper than those licenses that you're paying
Yes.
for from Microsoft.
Yeah, and we are selling. I've done some videos, and if
That's right.
someone
Yeah.
If someone did the math on it, they go, Tom, that server's about 100K. I'm like, sure was. And it's like, wasn't for me. But we get to play with it while it was there. I was amazed because it did pull 4,000 watts while we used it for cracking passwords, not AI, but it was
Yeah,
a 4,000 watt server. How do we know? Because we popped the fuses and melted a cord. That was, uh,
that's amazing.
yeah, the lab got interesting really quick. Because there was two problems.
Uh,
First, we popped the fuse, so we solved that problem. Next problem, we melted a power cord on the top of a server. Please note, roll back to 100K server. Then we're like, ooh, customer's going to be angry if they see a burn mark on a 100K server. Probably we
right.
should fix that. How do we get a burn mark off the top of a metal? Good news, it's metal, and it wasn't too melted, but
Yeah.
it did the
Just maybe peel it off, right? Just
yeah, you never think about the power cords used. I mean,
right.
they're consumer essentially desktop power cords that were in our box in our lab. We know we're
Mhm.
supposed to use the heavy duty ones, but when you unbox the server, we set it up and we box it back up. We usually the power cord's packaged because the way all the packaging is nice.
Yeah.
When it goes to the customer, all of it's nice and packaged with the proper high amperage power cords.
Yeah.
So we just used the ones we had. That was a terrible idea.
How
In
how big were
retrospect,
how big were the power supplies in that box? Do you remember?
Um, there was 4 of them, and the total wattage is a little over 4,000 that it pulled. I don't remember exactly how big they were. They could definitely handle more. So
Sure.
it was
Wow.
it was pretty wild. We just did the next round of them that we just finished that I haven't done a video on yet. The power supplies only would run on 220.
Yeah,
So
I would bet.
we
Yeah.
went bigger, and so that was amazing. That one would support 120. That's why it's cool. The downside is we have a second lab that we had to put the other one in because we don't have 220 up in our a lab next to our office. We have a lab in the basement of the building. It's got 220 where the servers are. So
Yeah. Yeah. That's the kind of service you need for something like that.
yeah. Good news is our building has plenty of power and we're building more. So I plan to do more videos on that. And I like all this stuff. It's been fun to play with all of it. So it's always fun to play with toys as they come to our office before we ship them out to the data centers they get racked in. But
Yeah.
you're right though about companies wanting it private. The automotive space that I work in, it's not my primary space, but it's where we've got some action right now for the budgets. And they're really excited because they have this old culture of secretiveness is the best way I can describe, which if you know anything about the automotive business, everyone knows what the competitors are doing. It absolutely is not a secret, but they all
Mhm.
pretend it is. While they're pretending it is, they won't let data go to the cloud. So they try to minimize any design data and everything. And of course, they're asking a lot of very proprietary questions about
Sure.
engineering, or they're modeling, of course. Everyone's trying to build the next self-driving car or data. So keeping all that private, been awesome. Seeing it a lot more on-prem. And it doesn't, the matter of fact, they did the math because of how much it costs to rent those type of GPU servers right now because of the high demand. I think they told me that they mathed it out for the level of load they have. It's only going to take them 9 months to pay it off. I
That's
was like,
wow.
under a year? So you're not even talking about amortizing it over 3 or 5 years. You're talking like what it costs to buy is so much less than what it costs. I mean, you think $100,000 servers is a lot, but then they're like, do you know how much it costs to run each one of these models in the cloud? We tested it. We we know how much
Yeah.
that is.
Yeah. That's amazing. Well, I mean, that makes sense too, right? That's why you see like Tesla having their own they're working on building out their own, right? To
Yep.
to be able to crunch that data too. So I mean that makes sense. If your business is going to be working on models for self-driving cars and that kind of stuff, you're going to run out of cash before you get what you need, right?
Yeah. And we're self-hosting at the office. We have a lot of customer data that may be somewhat proprietary. Obviously, we have to sign NDAs before we can work with some of these larger companies for special projects. Just to eliminate any fear of leakage, we went and grabbed a system, nothing really crazy high end. We just have a nice NVIDIA card in it,
Mhm.
something that, and a lot of home users have definitely done this. You pass it through, you set up a llama, and we called it the
Yeah.
bartender because its first use case was listing out all the drinks we had and coming up all the mixturing. He's a great bartender. So that is
That's
the
awesome.
yeah, we have its internal name is the bartender, which the salespeople also find funny.
Uh,
But that's what they throw their quotes in to help write better scopes of work. It'll actually do it does a great job if you say, examine the scope of work. Is there anything I missed? And then you can be interactive with it. And we've built prompts. If you haven't seen some like the Olama web interfaces, you can put prompt engineering so you can like predefine it and
mhm.
you sell it. AI is like a very not confident child that's a genius. You have to sell it like you're an expert at writing scopes of work. Here's an example of a scope of work and how it should look. Then that all prompt engineering goes there. And then the salesperson can get to it where they just type in, look at my scope of work. But you've already prompt engineered. You've said this is what a template will look like. That's a big thing once you learn prompt engineering and you really tighten it up. AI's output gets a lot better because you've kind of narrowed its parameters from being the everything box to being, oh, I'm an expert at just this for this session. Perfect. And then the outputs get a lot better, but we're never worried about a salesperson leaking something about a customer because it's all done internally.
Sure.
And it's not that expensive. It's the same thing. People, it's literally exactly what someone would do in their home lab, which I think is
Right.
cool. It's like, it's got its business use
Yeah.
cases and it's easy. I love all these open models. That is where I think that the home lab people should be playing with it. Play with these models yourself. You can, I've seen a couple people, I haven't tested it. Like, is it the Tensor card you can get with the Raspberry Pi? There's a couple like
Hmm.
code
Yeah.
models with the Raspberry Pis. I'm like, that's awesome. It's relatively inexpensive. Our friend Wendell from Level One Text has talked about a couple different
Hmm.
inexpensive GPUs for this. That's awesome. Start playing with this.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree. I played with a little bit too. I'm kind of when I have a 3090 that it has, I think it's got 24 gigs of RAM. That's more than enough to hold
Yep.
some of these larger models. And throwing it together was surprisingly easy for someone who has no experience in actually setting it up. And to the point where I was like, I can't believe this is free. Like I
Yeah.
at some point, like someone's got to pay for this. I realized, in Olam is run by Facebook. Is that
Facebook.
right?
Is it
Yeah.
Facebook? Yeah.
So yeah, I think it's Facebook. And so like at some point, they're going to want some, they're using it for their own means, but the fact that you can get all these models and some models are really good at writing code. Again, check your work, people. Don't just say
Oh,
push the
yeah. Because
send to
they
prod.
write it and then they write it wrong.
Yeah, exactly. But and it's kind of amazing that if you've got the hardware, and maybe that's the barrier to entry for a lot of people, because you need something, whether you have Tensor Core, uh, what was that, M.2 device, or you've
Yep.
got a GPU with enough VRAM in it. That's the opportunity to start playing with that now. If you're not, you're crazy if you're not. You should get into it. It's fun.
Yeah.
It's still a
I,
parlor trick. It's a parlor trick, right? But
yeah.
um,
It gets you some things, especially if you have the problem they have is like context windows, as they refer to them. So where you start the conversation, it can wander off and lose track of the beginning. But for asking
mhm,
it kind of basic questions like, hey, give me a small bash script that will complete these tasks, or write me an Ansible playbook to complete this. And you give it some descriptions, you give it some IPs, it'll get you, even if it gets you 90% of the way there, you're solving the blank page problem of, well, how do I
right,
write an Ansible playbook? What's the first command I type in? What's the first structure for that? What does a Docker compose look like if I didn't copy it from someone else? And
right.
it does a nice job of looking at it. It can also examine where you say, well, this person's doing it this way. I'd like to do it this way. So you give it a Docker compose and say, these are the changes I'd like to make to it. Highlight those changes or explain this to me. I love when it does that. And it does a reasonably good job of things like explaining what a line of code does. If you want firewall rules explained better, or I was doing IP tables the other day for a video. It does a nice job of adding nice descriptions for it that I threw in my forums. I'm like, I want to read the nice descriptions of what each line does. Thank you, ChatGPT, for doing that.
Yeah. Well, let's switch gears and bring it back to the home lab.
Ah, yes.
2025. What are your predictions for the home lab in general? Whether it's for hardware, software, what do you think is in store for us in 2025?
I think the mini PC revolution is just getting warmed up. The small and the micros and the minis. I mean, don't get me wrong. There's not like that the old Dell R740s and newer models that are out there that
Mhm.
are relatively reasonably priced for home and home lab. They're not going away. And there's going to be people who definitely run some of that stuff. But
Right.
I think this opens up a lot more. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. This opens up a lot more
You
people
too.
who
You
go,
yeah.
yeah, I don't have an area where I can plug something in that has a 200-watt idle and blows like a heater and makes a lot of noise. But the
Mhm.
mini PCs are small. The little B links that have come out there seem to be a better quality. There's a plenty of some of the off-brand ones. Mini Forums has become a really big competitor in that
Yep.
space, and now you can build some of these relatively low wattage, lower cost, quiet, and doesn't crank up your AC. Maybe you like it in the winter if you live in a colder state. But
Sure.
this opens it up a really easy access for people to do things. And of course, the Raspberry Pi has been an amazing project because of the amount of support it has. That's what I was doing just before I jumped on this, was setting up some Raspberry Pis for some demos, talking about Home Assistant. And I think that's just like where Home Lab is getting even bigger. And I'm here for it. It's awesome.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that on top of that, you have the performance now where you're seeing multi-gig, 10 gig in these little boxes as
Yep.
well. And, you know, if you're going to be running a home lab and you're going to start pushing around data, and whether you're building a small cluster or, you know, whatever you're doing with it, the networking was always one of the big limitations that they had, right? Like, I mean, it still might be if you're talking about how do you plug it into a switch and create a network with it, but realistically speaking, you're always limited to 1 gig. And I think you and I have talked in the past that, you know, you can build the clusters all day long, but if you're only pushing a 1 gig back end,
Yeah.
you're going to have a bad time. So I think that's an amazing thing that we're seeing great performant boxes and we're seeing high speed connectivity. I also think what I'm excited about is I see, and you named Minis Forum as a good example here, but you also take like 45 drives.
Oh yeah.
There's this visibility that home lab and home labbing isn't just a niche or necessarily just a purely niche thing where just a few weirdos who like to spend money doing these things on their own. Like it's an actual area of interest that they're making products for, like specific products that are designed to be used for this purpose, not just we took a computer and we call it a home lab. Like they are building systems that are focused towards that sort of stuff. And I think that's we're gonna I'm excited for the future in 2025 when it comes to like the options. Now someone wants to buy a nice box that is stable and reliable. They didn't have to cobble it together, and that's not going to be loud like a 1U or 2U rack server in a
Yeah.
garage, right? I think that's awesome. That's a validation, in my opinion, that these things that we like to do as hobbies are actually, you know, worthwhile and legitimate, and and businesses are seeing the value in that.
Yeah, I think this combined with the NAS revolution, the
Sure.
talk around any NAS right now has been a hot topic. It's pushed Unify to get into that game as well. And I can't fault Unify at $4.99. People are complaining about the features it doesn't have. I said it doesn't have that feature because the number one feature it has is $4.99. You got
Yeah.
10 gig connectivity at $4.99. That is part of the feature set of they're
It's the
selling
price.
you a box that holds 7 drives for with 10 gig connectivity, SMB, and has integration with Azure and Jumpbox and several other authentications. So they're kind of like, well, the business market might like this too.
Mhm.
And that's reasonable. Now, is it the end all be all? No, no. Most of the Homeland people are going, well, I want something more functionality. You
Right.
want the ease of use with like maybe Unraid, and Unraid's fine, but maybe you want to go like I do, more performant. I love ZFS. I love all the features and high end stuff you can do with TrueNAS. That's a great choice. And I think it's also the need people have realized for storing data isn't just pictures and stuff. That's actually pretty easy to store. It's just all the video files, and that's kind of
Mhm.
related to the media situation. Cable TV was expensive, so streaming like destroyed piracy for a while. We're just gonna say it.
Yeah. I
Like
remember that. Yeah.
for $7.99 a month, why would I ever bother to download? I had this incredible library for $7.99 a month. Absolutely unbelievable. But now it's it going from unbelievable to we're going to insert commercials unless you pay us $2 more. All right. Well, now we want $2 more, or we're inserting commercials again. Oh, by the way, you only get to have seasons 1 and 2. 3 and 4 went over to this service, but then don't worry, we got 6 back because we produced it, but we lost a license for this. And you're like, so I got to buy their subscription too, and then they do the same thing, and now it's a big mess. And I think
It
people are kind
is.
of going, okay, I just want to watch a show, and I wish, and maybe we'll see something way outside the topic of this. So I won't get too off topic where we could just pay the people who produce it and not have all of this. But if we could just say, hey, person who produced series I like, can I just hand you money and you give me a video file I can watch? That'd be great. We used to do that. We
Yeah.
call them DVDs.
Exactly, right? That was a very good transaction. I
Yeah.
hand you the money, you hand me the product. Thank you. Have a nice day.
Thank
Now
you.
you can't even go again. Right.
No,
Yeah,
no.
that's a good point. Yeah, especially what's old is new again. It feels like when it comes to that. It's
Mhm.
like, oh yeah, they demonized cable and everybody's like, yeah, cable sucks. I don't want to watch
Yeah.
this. And we all got rid of our cable. We cut the cord, and now I have four. I have 4 streaming services, and I think the bill for all 4 of them ends up being more than I paid for my Direct TV back in the day. So
Yes.
I don't know, man. Like I get it. I feel like maybe 2025 might also be like a swing in the opposite direction because it's a business. It has to have pressures from the outside, whatever those pressures may be, and then maybe they'll come back around and figure things out. So
Yeah,
yeah,
there's this efficiency thing in my head where I think about how inefficient it is for each one of us who commonly like a show, but each one of us are just holding on to that exact copy of data. I have a copy, you have a copy, you have a copy, so we can watch it. I mean, central management for all this would be great, but all these companies appear to need to make a profit margin that is at a level that doesn't make that to make sense. And we're back to buying hard drives and storing all of our stuff
Yeah.
back on it.
Yeah. It's weird. It's like I said, what's old is new again. It's like
Yeah,
we're back in the same spot.
we're back in the same
Uh,
spot.
doomed to repeat the past since we never learned from our ways.
Apparently.
Well, um let me ask you we'll kind of bring this to a close. What are you looking forward to in 2025? So anything
Ah,
special, specific?
yeah. Couple things. First, Home Assistant, I want to get more into it. It controls my studio and everything else, and it controls my house and lots of things. I love that you can self-host full automations, things that you normally would expect. Because my non-technical friends are like, "What do you mean it's not in the cloud?" And I always gesture to the rack of servers. I said, "But not the rack of servers. Someone controls it. This little Raspberry Pi, and it's a 3D printed case that's got the Home Assistant logo on it. It's small." I said, it takes a few watts. It's a Raspberry Pi 4, and it controls with Z-Wave all these lights and fancy things around my house, and it's really cool. So I'm looking forward to that. We're actually going to be rebuilding our lab. We have a couple offices, and we're reducing the number of offices. The lease is running out on one of the buildings. We don't want to renew. So that means that lab, which I've had for years, is going to come here to my studio. So I'm really
Nice.
looking excited to a refresh, rewire, rebuild. I've been in the planning stages, like, oh, I'm gonna do this, and this. It's gonna be a big undertaking. I wanted to move it here before, but it was there and we had the building. But now that the buildings go away, like, my hand has been forced and my plans are actually have to be put in action. So it's horrified and excited because I realized just how much is there. So I gotta figure
Mm,
out I gotta put probably new electrical in to run all this stuff. So it's gonna be a fun project. It's definitely optimistic and looking forward to some of the rebuilds. And of course, I'll be sharing it all on video and everything else
yeah, I
on
was
my
going to ask.
channel as we go through that.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that. Anytime I can watch someone build a from a ground up like that, I love it. That's the kind of stuff
I
I'm here for all day long.
Yeah. A few of our friends, our YouTube friends, like Techno Tim, has done a good job. I like that. I like his aesthetic, what he's done with his, because he's like, oh no, we're gonna go all white aesthetic on the case. And I think that's
Hmm.
really cool. I already have a black case. I'm not gonna repaint it. I went traditional, but
Yeah.
if it was an option, and maybe it is, maybe I could always, I guess I could repaint it. I don't know, but it's also got stickers all over it because I put all these silly hacker stickers on it. Because if you're a hacker, you put it on a laptop. Well, if you're a server nerd, you stick it all over your giant server case, so it's full of fun stickers.
Yeah.
And the last thing, and this came up with HexOS, and they mentioned it there, but it's not a new concept. A few people have talked about this. Is you don't want to necessarily store your data to cloud because cloud gets expensive pretty quickly, but the
Mm,
buddy backup system. I
mm,
really think there's going to be an opportunity to do that where we all have enough extra storage where I can create geo redundancy. Me and you live a pretty good distance apart. But
right.
if I had an encrypted way for a two-way transaction to happen where you have an encrypted blob that happens to be my data, only I have the keys to, and I reciprocate that. Here, you give me 10 terabytes and I give you 10 terabytes. Now we both have an offsite backup for things. I think there's a good concept in there for decentralizing how we do that with some of our other tech friends. And ideally, they're not your tech friends who are exactly geolocated for you. So it
Right.
lends
Yeah.
itself good to this. And you don't want necessarily your friends having or being responsible for what data. You don't want to be, I don't want to be responsible for what data you put on there. I don't want to know what it is. So making sure that this is very encrypted, very private. So
Hmm.
I hold the keys to my data. You just have an encrypted blob and vice versa. I think there's going to be a market for that going in the future. I think it's a cool concept. And I'm looking forward to kind of, I know how to do it with something simple like sync thing. That's a good starting point because there's a way to do it. But I think we could actually build some open source software. There are ideas and concepts over the years for a large decentralized file system. I remember participating in some of these like 10 and 12 years ago, uh,
Hmm.
large scale where you just held encrypted blobs, and the blob you held, you could get a percentage of that back to store it within the larger file system. It was all done anonymously through one central server, and it
Right.
never really took off. And I can't remember the name of it, but it kind of fell apart. There's a couple ones out there, but I think we're ready for a new transparent open source one where a lot of us could do that, because one more way to stick it to these cloud companies that want to stick it to us.
Well, I would be totally down. I've got plenty of free storage space, and I would love to be part of that. Yeah. you're kind of speaking about like the way that storage, which is a decentralized, but
Yeah.
they're a business, right? That you offer space up, and they in turn, if you don't host in there or store your own data in there, they pay you in the cryptocurrency. But I like the idea of like your payment is the space that you share, right?
Yeah.
That way it's and if you stop sharing, well, then your data is going to get wiped out at other places, and it just kind of organically grows and ebbs and flows and self heals as it needs to. So yeah, that would be awesome.
Yeah, I think there's a concept there, and I want to play. Is it called storage or storage? I wasn't sure.
Everything that I've ever heard slash read, it's storage.
Okay,
Like
storage.
they want you to say storage, but I
Yeah,
can't see the J and not go storage. So,
yeah.
but they, it's
For
it's
those
one of those.
wondering, STORJ is how they
Yeah,
call it. So
yeah,
I just keep calling it storage because that distinguishes that I'm actually talking about a distinct product, not generic storage.
yeah,
I want to test them. I'm always shy away from companies that integrate cryptos. I'm like, you're
yeah.
just you are, even if you have the best of intentions, there's something about rolling around with the pigs in crypto. I'm just saying.
Yeah, yeah. No, you're 100% right. I agree with that. I've been running it for a while since way back when I think when TrueNAS and IX Systems kind of worked out a deal with them and they made it natively available. I said, sure, I'll fire this up on my TrueNAS scale host and it's the kind of situation where if you're expecting to become a crypto millionaire, well, you look elsewhere, right? Like
Yeah.
it it's all going to be dependent on how much you provide the network, and then you'll get paid. And they list all their what they pay back in, but it's a cryptocurrency in the end, right? Their business is built upon people's good faith of providing data and power and storage, and they get and they pay you back in a cryptocurrency, which may or may not have a value at all, right? That kind of stuff. So, but I really like the idea of the decentralized storage
Yeah.
concept.
I could picture a company that does this, and I wish I could remember the name of one I participated a long time ago. It fell apart, but it was so cool back then because I've been in storage servers for a long time. It was neat because you just had these blobs of encrypted data, and they
Mhm.
used a torrent like protocol to create the network. It was kind of a neat idea, but then I could just say, yeah, and I didn't not know the data. It would just create a whole bunch of random files, and I would be part of the storage network. You had to contribute back more than you would get. Um, and it was because of the way the overhead and the redundancy worked.
Sure,
It's similar
that
to way
makes sense.
erasure coding works, where they have to have so many redundancy. So it wasn't a one to one, but it was still cool. And your files just were in this system. And when you would pull the files, you would get, this is the one downside to it, of course, for today, probably because it was easily attacked. You could see all the IP addresses that all the data was coming back from. It didn't come
Mm,
from a server, it was a torrent. So I would say, oh, here's all these IPs where my data is being flowed back to. Now, the keys and the encryption was done on your system, but it was a really cool concept. And I was like, I think there's a place for that. And maybe if some company, some open source project centrally manage it,
yeah.
we'll say it that way. And we pay them $5 a month for it. And that just does all the facilitating and
Mhm.
control side. And then we're providing the storage side. I think you could create a really reasonable, profitable business model for the company to keep the code going, keep someone from DDoS in a network or finding bugs in it, while at
Mhm.
the same time providing us a storage that scales properly.
Right.
So
Yeah.
it's a dream.
I mean, it sounds like an achievable dream, so that
Yeah.
would be awesome to see. Well, for me, yeah, I was gonna say for me, I have a few things. I have some really harebrained ideas that I feel like, it's time to do it. One is I want to try to, in a DIY sense, and this is where I think it'll be a chaotic mess, is I'd like to create my own water cooled server rack on my own, like radiators, maybe a chiller. I mean, depends on how much heat we're talking about, right? But like find a way to quiet down. So you mentioned like the smaller boxes and everything, but I've
Yeah.
I've got a 42U rack server in the garage, and when I'm like I've got a 4 node or a single 2U box with 4 nodes in it, and that thing howls like no matter how much you turn the IPMI fan data down or the fan speed down, it just screams. It's on fire, even though it's not literally on fire. It's just screaming like it's on fire. So I like the idea of trying to like build your own. Like, what does it take to have your manifold, and your hot and colds, and your
Yeah.
pumps, and your radiators, and your reservoir? And so that's a dream of
It
mine.
it's gonna be tricky building the blocks for some of those. That you said you had some Dell servers in there.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
That's where it's gonna be tricky.
I hope that and I'm my stuff is mostly. I'm moving towards like first and second gen scalable era, right? So I'm hoping that there's some standard, maybe some narrow or some square ILMs that I can leverage here to make things a little easier, and just maybe find some cheap Chinese. If this is mostly a test, right? Because like production wise, I wouldn't put the crown jewels in something that could leak all over, right? Like here's all my data, now it's all wet. Yeah. So yeah, I think the other thing I want to do is I have these crazy ideas for my own server chassis. And I think that I'm going to try to see if I can find a way to create that. Something that like I feel like if I took the things that I like about my storage system and my like virtualization system and turn them into a flexible platform that doesn't exist. We'll see. But yeah,
I will tell you the
we'll see.
people to reach out to is 45 Drives. I like when you go, and I did the factory tour and everything else with them. One, you don't realize just how big their factories are until you go there. You're like, oh, there's a lot of people here and they're doing some cool stuff. And one of the things they say, and it's on the walls as part of their ethos, is we're not mass production, we're mass custom. And it gives them ability to really tweak an individual. So you order something that's based on the HL15, but then customize a little bit to the way you want. So they're kind of interesting because
Mhm.
they have a good design team. They have several hundred employees, and their design team is actually pretty good at that. I got to see some of the unusual asks that people have.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So it's kind of neat. There's they make scientific engineering equipment for companies, like for very large companies. I didn't realize that until I was there. I'm like, oh, because I thought of Proto Case as a separate company. Then I realized it actually is and isn't. Legally, it's a different entity, but
Mhm.
their 45 Drives and Proto Case are really the same, and the same people own both. So
Yeah.
Proto Case is the manufacturing arm, and they do. If you say I want this, man, they do some. I have a video I'm going to be releasing pretty soon where they gave me a whole behind the scenes, and I spent a couple hours with their CEO just hanging out.
Well, that's
And
awesome.
yeah, I mean, he walked me through all his factory. We went from location to location, driving around and hanging out. So it's one of those things, as you know, when you have a lot of video to edit, it takes a long time before you go, take a deep breath. I need to sit down.
Yeah.
I have
Focus.
filmed for 2 hours plus of walking around. It was not scripted. It was just like grabbing cards and filling up the camera.
Yeah.
So
Oh,
now I got to put that together into a story.
yeah. Oh, and I will say the last thing, and this is
Oh,
actually inspired by you. So I guess I owe you thanks for this. I think in 2025, I'm going to officially bite the bullet and I'm going to start doing at least a weekly live stream. I think that that's my last thing
I
I wanted to make mention because
more than
it's,
happy to join you to help you out on it.
I would, you know what, Tom, maybe you'll be my first guest.
Yeah,
We'll see.
I love doing
But
live
absolutely.
streams.
Yeah.
I
It's
love
good
they're
stuff.
fun. So you drag a lot of people in there, ask the Q&A, get things going. It's a great time.
Yeah. But well, I think we'll call this because we've been talking this for a while. Thank
Need
you
some
so
predictions.
much.
I
Yeah,
can't
we
wait
got
to
our
see if we're
predictions.
right a year from now.
Right. Yeah, we'll do this. Let's make a tentative agreement to do this
Yes.
the tail end or the start of 2026, and we'll see how well we were or how madly incorrect we were.
Or we're sitting in a tent somewhere. We're wrong about this AGI thing.
Yeah, look, yeah, I guess we should end this with I for one welcome my AI overlords.
Yes.
And that's
Yes.
why I always say thank you to ChatGPT after every time I ask
I'm
it a
polite
question.
to it. It does help. I think it does. I don't know for sure.
Yeah, I hope so. When they're crushing the skulls like they do in the Terminator
Yeah,
movies, I
yeah.
hope
When
that they
Terminator
step
comes,
over
look,
me.
he said thank you.
I remember that one. We'll leave that one.
Yeah.
Uh, all right, Tom. Well, thank you again so
Thank
much,
you.
and we'll look forward to talking to you in this coming year.
I want to say a few words before we close out this video. First off, thanks again to the brilliant Tom Lawrence. It is always a pleasure to spend time talking with him. You can find Tom here on YouTube at Lawrence Systems. And secondly, 2024 was an incredible year for us here at the channel. And from the bottom of my heart, I want to thank you all for your support. And I'm excited to see what 2025 brings. Thanks for watching.